Principles of Evolution, Part 3.
All right, let's do part 3 of Principles of Evolution. This is going to be the final part. In the previous two series, or parts of this particular lecture series, we talked about the history of evolutionary thought and the way that things had to change. We had to have a change in the way that we thought about nature and the way that we thought about species. And we talked about several people who made contributions towards changing that. We also talked about some names, Wallace and Darwin and Lamarck, who made actually propose some ideas in terms of how evolution takes place. So today what I'd like to do is to talk about, in this particular part, the evidence for evolution. So let's jump right in and talk about the evidence for evolution, including the evidence that we have today, a little bit of that today, and then of course what Darwin had. I want to save a lot of the stuff, the modern day stuff for evolution, for some subsequent lectures. As we go through the rest of the course, I'll point out here's some more common or modern day evidence for evolution that Darwin didn't have, and I'm not going to talk about all of that, of course, right now, but I want to give you sort of a highlight of what we have today as well as what Darwin had. So the evidence, I'm going to talk about fossils. We'll talk about a thing called artificial selection, which Darwin relied on, which was really a big convincing part of the puzzle for him. We'll also talk about comparative anatomy. Darwin relied on comparative anatomy very well, including embryology. And then I'm going to talk about geographical distributions and adaptations that organisms have to very similar habitats, even though they're not closely related. Darwin noticed that this was a big piece. I also want to talk about comparative genetics. Comparative genetics, that's something Darwin didn't have. And finally, something Darwin had and something that we've continued to measure is natural variation. The idea that populations are variable. We're all a little bit different even though we're in the same species, which turns out to be a really important driving force for evolution and specifically natural selection. So let's talk about fossils. Of course, Darwin had a big array of fossil record. The longer time has gone on, of course, we continue to increase our fossil evidence for evolution. And at this point, remember in the 1850s, it had been accepted among biological circles that there were worlds that were gone, worlds that were extinct in terms of organisms that were extinct. These strange plants and animals that we don't have around anymore, those were now accepted to be extinct. This was a big contradiction or a big change in the way we thought about the scala natura that Aristotle proposed. Also remember that the particular layer of soil or sediment or strata that these fossils were found in gave us a relative dating system. So fossils real deep in the strata had very little resemblance to present-day plants and animals, and those higher up near the surface resembled modern-day organisms much more commonly. We also tend to find that, when you ask most people about fossils, people think of bones, right? Vertebrate bones tend to fossilize very well. Any kind of hard, mineralized part of an animal tends to fossilize if the conditions are correct. So we know that we have bones, but we also have evidence, or we have fossils of eggs in a nest. We have fossilized fecal matter. We have footprints that have been fossilized, and we also have even skin imprints on rocks. So our fossil record continues to increase as we continue to search for these fossils. And the fact that you have that relative dating system, this is a very important feature for fossils, and the idea that, hey, things do change, and we do not have organisms that we once did on this planet. Another part of the piece of evidence that Darwin had specifically, that everybody in this class is actually quite familiar with, is a thing called artificial selection. Now, we talked a little bit about natural selection, and so here I'm talking about artificial selection. And a good example that we as humans are aware of in terms of artificial selection are dogs. So artificial selection, This is basically when humans get involved. So this is not nature selecting anything. This is when humans get involved. And if you want a definition, we could define it to be the breeding of domesticated plants and animals to produce some specific desirable feature. So humans are selecting. They take that organism and they take that organism, and they mate them, and then they get offspring that have some specific desirable trait. Now, these particular matings that you did would have to be in the same species, but that's the variation. So when you look at these particular dogs in this photograph, they all look very different. They are really variable in their structure. However, they're all in the same species. And because they're in the same species, they can all reproduce. Which is very interesting. If you were to find variation like this in a natural population, in nature, you would all say that these dogs are all in different species because they look so different. But artificial selection happens very quickly because humans get involved and we start selecting. We say, well, I take that one right there, and I want to take that one right there, and I want to mate those, and I want to get a set of offspring that have some specific trait that I would like to have. And then we can continue to breed them that way and get specific breeds in the case of dogs that we want. Humans have done this for many, many centuries. We've done it with dogs, we've done it with cattle, horses, chickens, cats, pigeons, goldfish, and Darwin was in contact with these breeders, writing them when he was contemplating his ideas, and getting information about artificial selection to make some inferences on natural selection. So artificial selection is a big one. We can change the organisms very quickly when humans get involved, but this gave Darwin an idea about how nature may do it. Another part of the piece of evidence is a thing up here I'm going to call comparative anatomy. Now, as this slide is showing, as the images are showing, you see various animals here, vertebrates, that are indicated down here as these are flying animals, swimming, running, and grasping. So these are different animals that have different types of lifestyles, but it's specifically showing you the bones of their appendages. And what comparative anatomy does is that if you look at these particular bone structures, they've got them color-coded so that you can see, if we look at the human, for example, in the upper right corner, you can see the orange humerus, you can see the ulna and the radius down in the forearm, you can see the carpal bones in the wrist, and the metacarpals in the hand, and then the phalanges in the fingers. If you look across these various animals, regardless of whether they're a grasping animal or a running animal or a swimming or a flying animal, they all have the same bone structures. They all have a single humerus. They all have two bones in the forearm, the radius and the ulna, and then they have phalanges. They have carpals, although they're slightly modified, but they're all the same bones. And so comparative anatomy gave Darwin an idea that there's variation on a specific underlying theme, an underlying construction out there, that you have some original model of an organism that has been pushed and pulled, squashed and stretched, flattened and even rounded. And you get all kinds of variations around this very common repetitive theme. So what Darwin did when he's, of course, looked at this is he says, hey, there must be a common ancestor. And this common ancestor of all of these organisms has gone through repetitive forms of natural selection, the offspring at least have, and you get these various results of comparative anatomy. Even when we look at things like the number of vertebrae in a giraffe versus the number of vertebrae in a mouse. Some people may think that the vertebrae in the giraffe, there may be more because because the neck in the giraffe is so long, but that's not the case. We all have the same number of vertebrae in a mouse versus a giraffe. So comparative anatomy gave Darwin some insight into this idea of a common construction that's been modified through time. Now, there is also, with respect to comparative anatomy, when we look at embryos, this is a very interesting thing that takes place when we looked at embryology, and Darwin knew this as well. In the development of embryos of many organisms, you know, this on the left here we have a lemur, we have a pig in the middle, we have a human. But even if you do it with birds and fish and dogs and frogs, it turns out that they all go through very similar stages of development. In these three images on the screen right here, we have the lemur, we have pig, and we have a human that all have gills. They have gill slits in the throat area. They have webbing between their fingers, and they all have tails. At some point, and by the way, if you put a fish up here and a frog, you're going to see the same kinds of development. You're going to see the same kind of structures. But at some point, the fish stops, and the frog stops at another point, and the bird stops at another point, and eventually you get different kinds of structures, different kinds of characteristics at the end result once the organism is actually produced and born, if you want to call it born or hatch. So interestingly enough, embryology, when we look at embryology, it seems to represent kind of a quick run through evolutionary history, where, you know, humans, embryologically, we do have gill slits. We do have a tail. But we lose those structures as we no longer need gills. We don't live in water any longer. We don't need tails. Although we have a tail bone, it's a vestigial tail, which your book talks about vestigial, so make sure you take a look at vestigial, what that means. We have vestigial tails, and occasionally there are humans that are born with tails. They're not long or anything, but they have a little tail, and in fact, I had a student here once that actually had an uncle that had a tail, and I really tried my best to get a picture of that tail, but he would not let me do it. So it's not very common that humans have tails, that are born with tails, but it does happen occasionally. So comparative anatomy, that was another piece of the puzzle that Darwin actually had. Another piece that Darwin did not have that we have today is comparative genetics. Now, comparative genetics, you can also extract this out to comparative protein structures. You can look at all kinds of molecular data, but I'm just going to say here, well, let's just look at an example of comparative genetics. Now, if you haven't had genetics or haven't been exposed to any kind of genetics before, genetics is a field that we'll spend some time on, but basically in all populations, all plants and animals and fungi and protists and bacteria, we all have genetic material in the form of DNA. And the DNA code is composed of these letters that you see here on the screen: A's, T's, G's, and C's. There's 4. And we'll talk about what these codes actually mean and what they code for very soon. But what I want to show you here is that this particular sequence, they're comparing a gene. We're looking at a gene for a human and a mouse, and they're putting the genes right on, the letters of the genes right on top of each other, and you can see how they align. So right here, you can see how well those align right there. They're exactly the same letters. And then there's a difference right there in blue. And then those right there, that little section's the same. And then there's another little difference. And you can see throughout this, if you look throughout this entire gene, this I believe is a gene for producing cytochrome C in the mitochondria, which is important for energy production. So in a mouse and a human, you line these genes up, you line these letters in the gene up, and you see, hey, look how similar we are. Look how similar the gene in a human to a mouse is. Now, of course, there are differences. The differences are what makes us different, and those differences are highlighted in blue. So comparative genetics also gives us some ideas about the connectivity, the fact that we're all sharing some kind of common ancestor that through time has slowly accumulated changes. Right? That's how we define genetics, or that's how we defined evolution, was the change in the genetic composition of a population through time. And here we can see, now that we have all this molecular data, we can extract DNA, we can look at things like this, we can line them up, we can see how well did those predictions that Darwin made based on comparative anatomy and fossils and natural variation, how well does it match up to what we see genetically today? And Darwin hit it right on the head. So it was really quite remarkable. Okay, so that's comparative genetics. Let's go to the next one here. The next one is going to be geographical distribution. geographical distributions and the adaptations to similar habitats. Now, this one is something that has really nothing to do with sharing a common ancestor. But what Darwin noticed is that when you go to lands that have very similar climates, so you go to a desert, you go to a desert in North America, and you go to a desert in Africa, and you go to a desert in Australia, okay? Go to different deserts. Or you go to wetlands. Or you go to the Arctic regions or mountainous regions. What you tend to find there are plants and animals that really are not that closely related, but they have adaptations to living in those specific climates. So, for example, if you go to deserts, most desert plants are really tough plants. They're living in a very tough environment. They're living in an environment that has little water. So they have to do all these things, have to have all of these adaptations to conserve water. And so they tend to have thorns and spines to prevent things from eating them. They basically have strategies for conserving water. Animals in these desert climates tend to have really large ears, for example, relative to their body size, and that's to help regulate their body temperature. If you go to Arctic or mountainous regions, plants there, they tend to have a fairly quick growing season because it's so cold and ice covered most of the year. They also get little water, so they have water conserving strategies. They also have to bloom very, very quickly, and they have to produce their seeds very quickly. Okay, that's something that they all have in those regions because of the environment. The environment is governing how they do this and when they do this. But these plants and animals that are in these regions aren't that closely related. You can genetically test them. You can test them by comparative anatomy, and they're just not that closely related, but they have the same similar adaptations. So this made Darwin realize that even though you don't have a common ancestor, you can still have some similar characteristics. And your book talks a little bit about what's known as convergent evolution, and that's what this is getting at, is convergent evolution. Convergent evolution. So take a look at convergent evolution. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about that versus divergent evolution here. But convergent evolution is what he's speaking about here in geographical distributions. The final thing that Darwin had was the fact that he was just a good observer and noticed that there's just a lot of natural variation out in nature. That populations and organisms within populations are variable. Everything has some type of variation. Even if you look at this photograph, this is the same snail species. Every single snail in here is the same species, but they're all slightly different. There's no two snails in this picture that are exactly the same. They all have variation. If you look at humans, of course, every human is slightly different from every other human, right? There's a lot of variation out there in nature. Not only do we differ physically in terms of appearance, but we also have differences in immune systems and the capability to fight off disease. So there's variation working from the external appearance as well as from the internal function of the organism. So Darwin noticed that in addition to all of these things, especially this idea of natural variation, he noticed that the number of organisms, that number of squirrels, number of deer, number of starfish, whatever, they basically remain the same year after year after year. And this general stability indicated to him that the same number of organisms were probably maturing every year. Yet, as anyone who's halfway observant knows, there's many more offspring that are born every year that can actually survive. And so Darwin suggested that something is out there that's always keeping these numbers in check. Otherwise, we'd be waist high in frogs, and we'd be neck deep in cockroaches, right? Because cockroaches lay millions of eggs, but not every one of them is going to make it to survive to reproduce. And because populations are variable, this really drove Darwin to thinking about how this could take place, how natural selection could actually work to explain the process of evolution. Now, let me talk a little about his natural selection mechanism. There are several steps that I want to mention here that Darwin observed, and to summarize what we've already said. The first thing that I want to say is that Darwin observed, number one, that every year more offspring are born, more eggs are produced, more seeds are made than can possibly survive. There's just not enough resources. There's not enough food to go around. Okay? We know that. In fact, Darwin actually made a little calculation where he said that if you have two elephants, a pair of elephants, a male and a female, those two elephants could produce enough, let's say they could produce enough offspring, and their offspring could produce enough offspring. Basically, those two elephants could produce, after 750 years of all of their offspring reproducing, they could produce 19 million elephants if each offspring produced 6 elephants itself. So after 750 years, 19 million elephants could be in existence from just 2 elephants at the beginning. Well, we don't have 19 million elephants on this planet. So we know that this is not the case. We know that there are always more offspring that are produced and it can actually survive. The other thing that Darwin noticed, number 2, is that there's variation. There's a lot of variation in natural populations. And these variations may be advantageous, they may be disadvantageous, or they may have no effect at all. Okay? The organisms with those advantages tend to survive and reproduce. Okay, that's really important. You have to also reproduce. You have to survive and reproduce. And by doing so, they are spreading those advantageous genes down to following generations. Those with disadvantages die before they reproduce. Right? Either they get eaten by a predator, they can't escape, they can't blend into their environment, whatever it is, they get eaten, or they just have a poor immune system and they can't fight off disease. And given enough time, the process for selecting these advantageous organisms could gradually change an organism from one type to another. That's Darwin's idea of natural selection. It's very simple. It's a very simple, very elegant mechanism to explain what we see today. And so really what we see today are the survivors of natural selection. Natural selection is continuing to work, but those populations that we see today are products of natural selection and the survivors of natural selection, those that have been successful. I think it's estimated that about 99.9% of the species on this planet have gone extinct. So about 0.01% of them are still around, and that means that 0.01% of them were the ones that survived natural selection. So consider yourselves lucky, as we are in that category. Well, in Darwin's view, this process of natural selection was a very gradual one and required enormous amounts of time. And Darwin was missing a big piece of the puzzle, that he did not understand inheritance. No one really understood inheritance in the 1850s, although Greg Mendel, who was working on genetics, in fact is the father of genetics, was doing his breeding experiments, his famous breeding experiments in the 1800s. But Darwin and Mendel never knew each other. They never knew of each other's work. So we'll talk much more about genetics, and we'll see the mechanisms that Darwin didn't understand because he just didn't have the data, didn't have the techniques to do that. We'll talk about genetics very soon, and hopefully by that point you'll start to see how this could actually take place, how natural selection could actually work to produce the variation and the diversity of life that we see on planet Earth today.